no psychedelic art in this one. I had the benefit of seeing the former two presenters' slides, so I thought that they might have covered some of the other stuff that I didn't need to in my presentation. So, but I'll give it a go anyway. So I'm actually going to concentrate more on the people aspect of things. So you've been given an outline of what information governance is and some forms of how it could be implemented in an organisation, but I'm actually look at what that actually means in practice. So information governance has been described as sort of a super discipline which is emerging from the changing environment. And I would add to that it's a nascent super discipline. And David touched on this, and so did Susan. It's a subset of corporate governance, but it includes concepts from records management, content management, IT and data governance, information security, data privacy, risk management, litigation readiness, ready compliance, long-term digital preservation, and even business intelligence. There's a lot there. But I've highlighted it's a subset of corporate governance because that's obvious, isn't it? But I actually want to unpack that assumption because it was actually an assumption quite like that actually led me to start my PhD in the first place. So a few years ago, the one thing that Matt didn't mention is I'm also an associate of the Governance Institute. So I have a degree in corporate governance. And I was asked to write an article on the link between good corporate governance and good records management, because that's obvious to the converted. But when you actually go and look at the literature, there's almost nothing written on it. And when you actually look at the literature, the corporate governance literature at least, talks about information in a completely different way. So that's what led me to kind of go on the PhD journey, was to, within the records management and information management community, many of those things like accountability and the link between governments are completely well understood. But they're not actually understood in the same way in other disciplines. So this is another governance model. This is the information governance reference model. But if I was sitting on a board, and I have sat on a board in the past, the things that would excite me would be the business value, the privacy and security risk, because that's big news at the moment, and cybersecurity is all the rage, and efficiency from IT. And compliance risk, and as we're discovering from the Royal Commission, sometimes that's not even a thing on the boards. But kind of the rim bit down the bottom isn't quite so exciting, is it? And generally, we've been good at the whole discover, retain, archive, and dispose, but even most executives will admit that defensible disposal would assist them, but they don't have the money or the time to start a disposal program. But actually, it's that whole business value thing that records and information management, at least, hasn't necessarily been good at getting hold of. So as part of I'm glad David brought this up. As part of my doctoral research, I actually interviewed staff from 4 different Australian government agencies. And I looked at how information and records was basically constructed in that organisation and what it meant in that organisational context, and then compared and contrasted those cases. But part of that discussion and the interviews that I did, I actually learnt about the baseline capabilities of the employees in those Australian government agencies. And disclaimer, I'm also an Australian government employee right at this point, but I'm not here in that capacity. But when David first unveiled this at a conference a few years ago and the capability matrix was rolled out, I thought to myself, oh yeah, the common garden public servant will never have that level of capability. But actually I was wrong. Now, my sample study might not be necessarily representative of every public servant, because the records managers in each agency selected people for me to actually interview, and they were predisposed to being involved anyway. But actually, quite surprisingly, when it comes around to the general principles, most of them really understood the general principles around information management. They had some degree of legislative awareness. Not surprisingly, the lawyers had more, and the information managers had even more than that. They understood this, what implied in their agency environment, and they pretty much had a basic understanding of the disposal, the records lifecycle kind of model, that actually eventually either it got kept as an archive or it got destroyed. The one thing that didn't really come through was that link between information governance and risk management. And so there was some understanding that record keeping related to risk management and agency reputation, but on a whole heap. Only in the severest kind of cases when the proverbial hits the fan and you end up on the front page of the newspaper, but in their actual day-to-day life, it didn't really figure. But they were actually doing it without realising it. In their own practices, they were actually making judgments about risk in relation to how they actually kept records. So one of the things I actually wanted to, when I started this, was to understand how other professions defined that concept and thought of that concept. So whereas we tend to think of it at a kind of a base transaction level and nearly everything's a record, but I don't think like that. So their kind of understanding is a bit more high level. So they would keep records in relation to things that they thought were high risk. So while they didn't necessarily associate it with that, their record keeping practices mirrored that, well, this is important, so I should keep something, but this is not important. Now we might consider that that is still a record, even though it's not important in their mind. But so I guess that's like what I wanted to get at is this problem of, I guess, shared understanding when it comes to a lot of this stuff. And in a recent Information Governance ANZ survey, 49% of respondents felt that their leadership had failed to address information governance, with 80% of them stating that the major barrier to that was lack of understanding, and 50% citing lack of executive support. The main driving factors for projects were external regulatory pressures. So there are, in highly regulated industries, more pressures on people to do things like that. But only good business practice, improving good business practice only came in at 59%. And only 10% of the organisations surveyed felt that their information governance policies and procedures were mature or well advanced. In fact, most said that they were at the early stages of development. Oh, hang on, wrong way. So, what does that mean for the role of the Chief Information Governance Officer? Because it's a new thing, and, well, it's actually a really, really, really broad remit. So, in terms of all of the things that person, if we take that list of things to begin with, so cybersecurity, information management, risk management, privacy, data protection, litigation, all of those kinds of things, that needs to be brought together, under an umbrella. And, one way of doing that is to have the Information Governance Committee, which has all of the key stakeholders involved, and then the SIGO chairing that committee. And certainly in the agencies that I went to, that was what they had chosen to do. In terms of the chair of the committee was the SIGO, all of the stakeholders were on that strategic committee. But in terms of one person, being able to advance the cause of information governance, what are the kinds of skills that, well, these are the kinds of skills that I think, oh, hang on, done it again, that person's going to need to possess, because I think the main barrier is going to be actually understanding and actually promoting what information governance itself is and coming up with some kind of strategic direction for an organisation that brings all those threads together. I went to the Digital Excellence Awards at the launch of Information Awareness Month last night in Canberra, and the presentation that was given by Professor Dr. Marek Kowalkiewicz of Queen Elizabeth University of Technology. He's the chair of the digital economy at QUT, and he gave a fascinating presentation about what he called the art of living in the digital economy. And ART stood for aspiration, R for responsibility, T for trust. And he invited us all to think about information management and records management in particularly has been more about the T for trust, the hindsight, making sure that we collect a record of something, that we can look back on it and trust it. But actually, we need to shift that. And we're suggesting we need to shift that and put as much emphasis on the aspiration and the future looking, as well as, and take responsibility and accountability and have a duty of care to make the information we have, be a force for good, if you like, in the digital economy, and actually shift that so that we're not only looking at hindsight, but insight, and dare I say, foresight. And he envisaged a world where, you might actually be typing an email and, the assistant will come up and say, this looks like something that, somebody else was typing 5 years ago because it can match all the text and the sentiment to, the email store. Would you like me to, complete this? And these people were copied last time and blah, blah, blah. And when you think about that, given the artificial intelligence and things like that we have, maybe that world isn't too far into the future. But I guess we have to think like that. We have to innovate. We have to be forward thinkers, not just the passive capturers of information. So skills like alignment and influencing with the organisation, innovation and collaboration, stakeholder management, the promotion of what the value proposition is. And of course, the big one, change management. In every organisation, it's constantly changing. So they're kind of that's on top of the technical capabilities that are in the matrix, but the person who leads that has to be that beacon for change. So they're my thoughts on leading information governance, and I think we now have